Hey there guys, so I want to thank you for taking the time to check out today's, of course, video. And in this video, I want to, of course, go over a unique topic, a topic that is still, of course, connected to what I normally discuss when it comes to LGBT, of course, topics, gay topics in particular. But this topic I am very excited to talk about because I think it's, of course, really relevant to me as a person because I grew up around a lot of these, I guess you would say, characters and concepts. And what I want to go over is sort of the, I guess you would say, earlier sort of characters that shown up, or sort of the history of gay characters being shown up in a lot of video games. So if you're not aware, I am very much a gamer. I've been collecting video games for a long time, and I don't really share it as often. Sometimes I'll share some photos of my video game collection, but I don't really, I guess, go out of my way to really share it. But I grew up around video games. To give you sort of a short, quick history, when I was growing up, I used to watch, like, whenever I was really young and I was a baby, my brother had a Sega Genesis when I was growing up, and I used to watch him play video games on there. Mortal Kombat, a lot of those games I remember. And I also was, growing up playing PlayStation. Used to play Crash Bandicoot a lot on the PlayStation when I was growing up. Man, that was basically his PlayStation, and then he gave it to me. And then I had a PlayStation 2 growing up. And so throughout throughout my entire, life, childhood, adulthood, I grew up around it. I used to play the PC quite a bit. And so there's a lot of very fond memories, sort of a nostalgia that comes with video games. And so when I became an adult and I was able to earn my own money, it sort of became this big thing with me where I was just like, I want to collect all of these games that I never was able to sort of buy whenever I was younger. And so, again, it just became this thing to where I want to collect these things. And there is I don't know how you describe how I can fully describe why gaming and collecting games has become this thing, but something with video games has been a soft spot for me. It's, I think, to become an escape. Like I've mentioned with entertainment a lot of times, video games always became that escape from the reality of everything. And I always seen it as that way for me to, express myself outside of the real world. And so that's why it's became such a big thing with me. And so one thing that has really resonated with me a lot throughout my journey is a lot of the characters, especially when you talk about earlier video game characters, when the representation of gay characters wasn't as, I guess, prevalent. So like what I discussed before, and there was a video where I discussed some of the video games that I played when I was younger. And of course, I've touched on The Sims before, which is a simulation game where you create your own characters. And like what I've mentioned in that previous video, The Sims is a video game that allows you to create your own characters, of course, your own Sims, and put them in a simulated world. And The Sims was one of those games, and The Sims came out in '99. So it was one of those games who had kind of that earlier representation of gay characters, where you could have gay characters in those games. And so that was The Sims. If you've not heard much about sort of the background of The Sims, or sort of the underlying, I guess, community of The Sims, it is very much a sort of there's a big overall gay community around The Sims because of its sort of openness and sandbox top, dollhouse sort of concept that The Sims is. And so there's a lot of gay people who grew up with that game, and it sort of became I guess you would say, a safe space, or there's a community that was built around The Sims. And so again, The Sims was one game. I always consider it one of my favorite games. It will always be a very important game to my upbringing. It is a childhood game, and I still play it to this day. I still get a lot of enjoyment from that game, and I will always have positive memories of that game because it was an escape for me. It was a place for me to place myself in, to really just be in this world and just escape the reality, that I was facing. And one thing I want to do is sort of go back and discuss throughout some of the earlier, history of video games. Like what I've mentioned, I'm very much into retro collecting. I've collected a lot of, older games when you go back to like your Nintendo NES games. Well, I actually don't have those games, but I have very fondness for a lot of the old classic games. I do want to collect NES and Super Nintendo. I don't have those, but I do have some Sega Genesis games and things of that nature. And what I want to discuss in particular are some of the older games when you go back and sort of the more formative years of video games, how gay characters were actually sort of, I guess, represented in a lot of ways of those games. And so when we go back, for example, there is a character, let's say, like you have the games like Street Fighter. Of course, Street Fighter is a very popular fighting game. You've likely heard of it. It's had movies, and it's had some, I guess you would say, really big, I guess, sort of fan base. And it is pretty well known, even outside of, if you're not a video gamer, you've likely heard of Street Fighter. But in the earlier years of the Street Fighter games, there is a character in Street Fighter that has sort of a queer representation, and that character is known as Vega. So that is a very much queer represented character in that game. And even though when that game came out, because you think of Street Fighter like being in the 80s, 90s, sort of, that sort of time frame, even though, of course, that was not a topic talked about in video games at the time, that was a character that was always sort of had that representation in video games. Another example could be, Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy itself has been around a long time. Of course, the first Final Fantasy was like, you would say, I want to say Final Fantasy came out in the late 80s. As far as the first game, when you talk about sort of the NES period, SNES, that sort of period of games. And so Final Fantasy itself, if you're not aware, the community of Final Fantasy has a lot of there's a lot of gay fans in the Final Fantasy community. And, as far as the fan base itself, has a lot of gay fans. And a lot of the games in the Final Fantasy series have sort of had some underlying gay characters. In Final Fantasy VI, I believe it's Final Fantasy VI. I think I'm getting it right, because there's been so many. But there is a villain in that Final Fantasy that is known as Kefka. And Kefka is actually one of my favorite characters in the Final Fantasy series. But Final Fantasy VI was on the SNES at the time, and or the Super Nintendo, and so he was a very flamboyant, out there character, and the style that they gave him, a lot of people, alluded to him being a gay character. And I've always liked his design. He is very flamboyant. He's kind of this, he does kind of have a clownish, what would you say, almost like a mom type character design, or like a jester character. But he was always kind of one of my favorite, I guess, characters in that series, along with the main character of Final Fantasy VI. And of course, that was one of the first games too to have more of a female protagonist. So Final Fantasy itself has kind of been groundbreaking in that sort of franchise, because it was really ahead of its time, whether that be placing more female characters as the main characters in games, or whether that be creating more of these open gay characters in their games. Like, for example, going to more newer, I guess, examples of video games having gay characters. Final Fantasy 13 was one game that I kind of grew up with. Of course, I'm 31. And in my high school years, Final Fantasy 13 had just came out. And in Final Fantasy 13, if you've seen some of the story in that game, there is a lot of, sort of really subtle hints to a lot of the gay characters. So one of the main characters in that game, you have, of course, Vanille, and then you have Fang, which is another character in that game that you play as. And so, of course, that series in itself, you kind of play, there's a lot of, basically, you have a party of characters that usually work together in that game. So, of course, you play as that party of characters, and Vanille and Fang is usually in your party of characters. And in the story, there is a lot of subtle hints with Vanille and Fang sort of being in sort of a relationship, even though it's not really, I guess you would say, mentioned in the game. But there's some subtle hints. And then, of course, Final Fantasy 13 has a female character as sort of its main protagonist or main character, with Lightning. And so she kind of has a very eccentric sort of style to her. She is very much what you wouldn't consider her as a normal, I guess, female protagonist, because she can be very aggressive. She's a more aggressive type character, but she is a feminine character. So that in itself, again, Final Fantasy, I think, has been very groundbreaking with a lot of its characters, where the characters are, you have a lot of queer sort of underlying messaging in Final Fantasy games, which I find very interesting, although it's not outright said. Even in some newer games in the series, there have been gay characters outright that they've really shown, characters like gay characters kissing and this and that. So some of the newer games have been very open about having those types of characters in the games. But I find it interesting when you go back into the history, like even in the early days of some of those characters, you have sort of that representation. And so that's why a lot of the community around Final Fantasy, why there are a lot of gay fans in the community, because the series always has had somewhat of a really eccentric style to it in their character designs. And even like when you think of like other franchises that are, of course, Final Fantasy is pretty much well known, but you think of franchises like that wouldn't really, you would associate with having gay characters, but like in Super Mario. So like you think of the character Birdo, everybody has always said Birdo is considered a more queer type of character, even though that character is more of a dinosaur. That's sort of been an earlier example of in like Mario, where you've had sort of that representation, which is kind of interesting. But throughout gaming, I think that is why there are a lot of gay people who connected with games, because even in the earlier years of video games and classic gaming, there's always been this sort of representation of these characters. And like, even again too, like when you go into like the era of like, even when gay characters aren't as prominent as they are now, when you go into like the PlayStation 3 era, there is a series called Nier, and there is some hints of the character in that game, which is Emil, one of my favorite characters in that game. He is sort of a soft-spoken character, and it, of course, hints at him being a gay character. And there's very interesting storylines in the Nier games. But I just think it's very interesting when you go back and then you go to how gaming has evolved and how it's become more open with its characters. It's very interesting. And I know not a lot of you guys are maybe very a gamer or may not be as interested in games, but again, like what I've mentioned with a lot of sort of entertainment mediums, like when you talk about movies, TV shows, like what I've talked about in the past, video games is really the biggest thing that I grew up around. And so a lot of these different characters, it's really interesting to see how the representation of these characters is shown in these games. So I just wanted to talk about that. There could be a lot more that I could talk about that, because there's a very interesting history with video games and sort of the characters and stories that are told in these games, where you have very, very touching stories that really go into detail on these characters. So I just think it's interesting to talk about, and especially for a type of entertainment that I'm very fond and very passionate about. It's so interesting to see how it's evolved as an entertainment form and an art form in itself, because it is very much an art form. But thank you guys for watching. I hope that this was interesting. There's a lot of things I could discuss with video games and those gay characters being in video games, but thank you guys for watching. If there's something you would like me to discuss in the future, feel free to let me know. But I always enjoy talking about these things. I enjoy sharing some of these interesting things, even, how it connects to my life. And I think these characters and these stories connect to a lot of people too, especially if you were a younger gay kid growing up. It's very interesting to see these sort of characters represented in this form. But thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.